milk cartons with pictures of missing children have become commonplace, but the very first boy ever to be placed on a milk carton is still missing. His name is Johnny Gosch.
If you're old enough, you may find yourself sometimes feeling nostalgic for the 1980s. It was, after all, an optimistic time in a cutthroat kind of way. It was a decade that was filled with materialism and consumerism, and a decade that brought us blockbuster movies and also the birth of cable and MTV.
Got a life in 1985.
But there is a darker side, and one that we try hard to forget sometimes. Missing children were a painful and a threatening problem in the 1980s. With a growing sense of alarm, Americans began to see pictures of their missing children pop up everywhere. They were on milk cartons and grocery bags. They appeared on billboards and TV commercials.
It's very necessary that we get the message out so that their child doesn't end up on a button like our son did.
And as the times changed, the rules about kidnappings changed. There were no more ransom demands. Parents didn't receive phone calls from the kidnappers. There was no instructions to the parents in most of these cases. And the police, they weren't really listening in anymore. We now had new and horrifying twists to face. Fears of sexual abuse and sadistic impulses, not money. These were the new motives. And because of these new rules, parents would now feel vulnerable to a crime that a generation ago was only really a concern in the homes of the wealthy. But what had changed? Was it the satanic panic, or was something else causing this shift? Over the course of the next few episodes, we're going to be going over the mysterious case of Johnny Gosch. And believe me, this is a fascinating case. This has everything in it. Implications that go all the way to the White House. We're going to be looking at the Finder's Cult. We're going to be looking at the Franklin Credit Union scandal. We're going to be looking at a high-ranking military member that was involved in not only MK Ultra, but also founded a satanic temple called the Temple of Set. But as you see over the course of these episodes, that this case creeps and it has so many ties to so many powerful people that you're going to be asking yourself, what happened to Johnny Gosch? Could Johnny Gosch still be alive even after being missing for over 30 years? Is he using a different name? Is he in hiding? And why? What would lead to that? So those are some of the things I want to be covering in this episode. Let's just dive into it. From deep within our abandoned FEMA bunker studios, it's Invisible Ships. Johnny Gosch went missing on September 5th of 1982, and that was the last time that anyone had ever seen him. There had been no new developments in his case for years, until strangely 2005, of all places, the White House.
There is another controversy brewing tonight. This one involves the Bush administration and the news media. It is the talk of Washington these days. It involves a man who was a regular in the White House press briefing room. He was free to ask President Bush and his press secretary questions on a regular basis, but it turns out he wasn't really a journalist and wasn't using his real name. And there is more to his past that is making a lot of people wonder what he was doing in the White House in the first place.
Okay, stop. You're probably wondering what any of this has to do with the disappearance of Johnny Gosch. Here's what we're talking about. That last clip is referring to a strange press conference that happened back in 2006. It's where a man from an obscure right-wing news outfit was posing as a journalist, and he started pitching these real softball questions to the president. And in the process, he got a lot of people curious about who he was and where he came from. Here's what he asked the president, and it's a question that's so friendly and so ideologically leading that the rest of the press corps was left stunned.
Senate Democratic leaders have painted a very bleak picture of the U.S. economy. How are you going to work? You've said you're going to reach out to these people. How are you going to work with people who seem to have divorced themselves from reality?
What? Who is this guy? Well, after a few days of digging into this man's background by members of the media and online bloggers, all kinds of weird things began to turn up, and it ended up raising even more questions.
Good evening. The White House thought it had a tiny scandal on its hands, a storm in a teapot over the granting of credentials to a writer from an unknown news organization operated by a Texas Republican politician, a pseudo-reporter who asked questions of the president and press secretary so softball in nature that they embarrassed even arch conservatives. Turns out that was the good news.
For one thing, he was using a fake name, okay? He was calling himself Jeff Gannon, but his real name seemed to be maybe James Dale Guckert. And there's a lot of controversy there. I mean, A lot of people aren't sure if James Dale Guckert is even his real name. But the following episode, we're going to be referring to him as Gannon or Jeff Gannon, just for the sake of simplicity, because he does go under a lot of names. Anyway, it seemed really hard to believe that in this post 9/11 world that we were living in, that somebody using a fake name could pass background checks and even be given regular access to the White House, even up to the president. And speaking of his credentials, well, it turns out that Gannon is not even a journalist at all. We know that he never obtained a congressional press pass, which is what you need to be allowed to cover the White House press briefings, okay? It is the standard pass that journalists must have to cover events at the White House.
I do not understand, having covered the White House for as long as I did, how he got, I just don't get it, how he got a press pass on a false name, on an alias. I don't know how that happened. You have to be cleared through the Secret Service in order to get a press pass, which you have to wear at all time. I mean, there's something behind this story that hasn't come out.
But somehow Gannon got in, and he kept getting in. Somebody from the White House staff would just wave Gannon on in, and so he'd been there multiple times. And then the pictures came out, and by pictures, I mean a lot of sexually explicit photos of Jeff Gannon. Because it turns out that Gannon is not a journalist, but he is a former gay prostitute. And he used to call himself Bulldog. He offered his services to Washington's elite. Gannon used to advertise himself as like this buff military type with a high and tight crew cut, and he was the perfect date for the closeted conservatives who ran Washington in those days. Gannon even worked as a model, and was appearing in some homosexual pornography under the name Hot Military Stud. So this was all really beginning to look weird and kind of like a conspiracy. Jeff Gannon's name, the name Gannon, would come up in the Valerie Plame CIA leak, which was a big political scandal that revolved around a journalist named Robert Novak, and he publicly identified Valerie Plame as a covert Central Intelligence Agency officer, blowing her cover just before the Iraq War. So is Jeff Gannon a spy? Does he have ties to like the CIA or whatever? I mean, a lot of people think he might have. In fact, you have to admit that there is something going on that we can't explain. We cannot explain the amount of access this guy had, or how he was able to utilize a fake name and get through all that stuff, skip all the steps with Secret Service. Anyway, just when you think you hear it all the weird stuff about the prostitution and his pornography and all that, the story's gonna take another turn. It's gonna get even weirder because there are a lot of people that think that Jeff Gannon may actually be Johnny Gosch. And these people aren't just a bunch of online conspiracy theorists or YouTubers or podcasters, but even people like a retired New York City police detective, some members of the FBI forensics unit, and even Johnny Gosch's own mother are wondering if Jeff Gannon may actually be that missing boy Johnny Gosch. And they do have some good reasons for wondering this. For one thing, they both share a lot of the same facial features. In fact, they have a very similar facial bone structure. And these are exactly the type of characteristics that law enforcement is going to look at. If they don't have the person there to physically fingerprint or take DNA or whatever, they'll look at photographs of, whoever they're looking for and the suspect. And they'll look at that and they'll try to match them up, like based on the height of where their ears are and the size of their nose and stuff like that. So those people are saying that that's a real good match for Johnny Gosch. Johnny Gosch and Jeff Gannon also have the same colored eyes, and they reportedly share some very similar birthmarks. There's another interesting twist to all this too, in that, Jeff Gannon's alias names have always kept the same initials, JDG, which is the same initials as Johnny Gosch. And we know that the name Gannon is an alias, it's a fake. Remember, his quote-unquote real name is James Dale Guckert, or JDG, same initials. That's interesting that the initials are the same, but it ultimately is also meaningless. You're not going to build a case on that. You're not going to convince anybody because the initials are the same. Another more interesting thing to do with the name is the fact that he chose that name. Remember, Gannon is an alias. That's a fake name. His real name is quote-unquote James Dale Guckert, right? So he chose that Gannon name as an alias. And the editor of the paper for the Des Moines Register, which was the paper that Johnny delivered the newspaper for, and he was actually kidnapped on his route. Well, the editor at the time of Johnny's kidnapping was a man named James P. Gannon. So, some people look at this as like, is this a breadcrumb? Is this something that he's leaving, like a little signal of who he actually is? Or is it just another one of those coincidences? The $1 million question, though, is if Jeff Gannon was Johnny Gosch, why wouldn't he just say so? And that goes to the whole heart of what this case is about and who might be involved, because the more we look into this case, the more you're going to see that there are different groups, military, the cult, CIA involvement or alleged involvement with this case, and that would make it impossible for him to return home. So let's explore why Johnny can't come home. And to do that, we need to go to the very beginning, all the way back to 1982, to the night before Johnny Gosch's disappearance. Okay guys, that's it for this one. This has just kind of been the introduction to the Johnny Gosch case. Please join us for episode 1. I'm going to be giving some details about the actual abduction, and then we're going to be moving on over the next couple weeks, talking about everything from a strange cult called the Finders to MK Ultra, and all of this relates to this case. Like I said before, it goes all the way up to the White House. So please, I want you to join us, and we're going to go through this together. There's a lot to unpack. That's why I had to do this intro, just to kind of give a basic outline to where we're going. Appreciate you joining us. You guys take care.